Sudeep.
Hello. Good
Welcome.
morning.
Good morning. It's really nice to see you here in our office.
It's a very nice office.
Thanks. How's the traffic?
Let's not get started on that, otherwise the rest of the conversation will go there.
Yeah. No, but again, thank you for being here. And I've told you this before while in a little chit chat in the room in there. I was looking forward to kind of chat with you. I think one has heard so much about you earlier, someone being from the HR fraternity in the leadership role, going through the kind of profiles that you've had with different companies. So with the questions that, I have on my mind for you, and I know you do have a few on your mind for me, I'm really looking forward to this conversation between us.
Likewise, I've been looking forward to this, and I think it's a great initiative that you've started. So congrats on that. And I'm kicking myself for not having thought of it earlier.
You can join us. We'll call you again.
I will.
Okay. All right, cool. So it's Pride Month, isn't it?
That time of the year.
It's that time of the year again. Again, inclusion, the buzzword out there. One of the questions that I've personally had on my mind is, do you feel like this whole burden of inclusion is a lot on the queer community themselves? What do you feel about that? I've honestly, I've kind of had a conflict with this at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, but. And the but part really comes from the fact that we are living, organizations are also a microcosm of society. Mm-hmm. So when I was speaking to someone who just moved to Bangalore about a few weeks ago and saying exactly the same thing, saying, why does the burden of feeling comfortable and included fall only upon me? Why am I not feeling welcomed and connected? I hear that from new joiners in an organization, for example, all the time, saying it's all my job to get myself connected, get myself productive. Nobody else makes any effort.
Right.
And I hear you. I hear the same thing from, say, the queer community as well, right? And so on. So yes, in a way, I wouldn't say it's very different. It's a microcosm of society, and we generally need to be a lot more welcoming. But I think it does make you pause a little bit and think about saying, using the same analogy for new joiners, while yes, the onus of integrating and getting productive lies upon new joiners to a great extent, the organization also provides some framework around it, right? There's an induction, there is a buddy program, there's other stuff that's happening. What do we do for the queer community? What kind of safe spaces do we create, right? One of the things, for example, that we did in Walmart Tech, which was a previous organization, and when we were for the first time hiring people from the transgender community, there was a lot of apprehension. And interestingly enough, the apprehension actually came from the point that the people who joined the organization might actually get more uncomfortable with people from the support staff, housekeeping, security, etc. Right. So we were partnering with Periphery, and they actually helped us conduct sensitization sessions for the support staff for like 300 people across, right? Saying that, we want to make sure that we create a space where people coming in don't feel that way. But that is obviously a very visible part of it. But the non-visible part of it, I think the answer really just lies in creating a culture of inclusion overall, where everyone feels included, right? The whole thing about being able to bring yourself at work, your whole self at work, or your best self at work, that path to creating that culture of inclusion is the one that is the difficult part. Because once you've created that culture, irrespective of what your demographic is or what your identity is, you will feel included. But if it isn't, then nobody feel included. It's not a coincidence that teams in which queer members feel connected and included are also teams which have high gender reverse representations. They have high engagement scores, because generally they are creating a culture that is warm and inclusive and welcoming, as opposed to toxic cultures. So that's how I think about it. I think it does, to a certain extent, some of it is unavoidable. Right. Like I said, we are a microcosm of society, but I think some of it is definitely avoidable if the organizations make the right choices.
I get it. Now I hear what you're saying, and I think I really like the idea that you put the spotlight on, where it's inclusion overall. And honestly, every Pride Month, every time of the year, again, June comes, I'm very conflicted on saying, okay, again, I'm from the community myself, and I talk about Pride and say Happy Pride. Am I excluding all other parts of inclusion?
Yeah.
So I really like the fact that you put, I think your point of view and your thought is a little more larger and wider when it comes to inclusion overall as a theme. Example that you picked up on, induction and orientation, and how the onus should not be on the new person. While we say that you also need to be proactive, we're also hiring people who are, highly energetic and proactive, get your things done on your own. But at the same time, I think as companies, we need to do our part too.
Exactly. Like the recruitment teams, right?
Right. Yeah.
The first point of contact, right? If we can sensitize our recruiters on the agenda and sensitize them to talk about pronouns proactively, for example, or ask sensitive probing questions right at the very start, it just lays the foundation and makes it easier versus more difficult for any member of the queer community to feel a relationship with the organization. That's the first point of contact. So that's a good place to start.
Right. Now, that brings me to, this whole point of representation, right? Now, we spoke about a safe space, and then the other word that's in front of me is representation, which means if anyone's joining a company today, if I wanna, and I'm going back to, if I'm queer, right, and from the community, and I come in and join a company, how important is representation for me? If I need to feel safe, which means how important is it for me to visibly see leaders, people out there, everyone using pronouns by default, using the word partner instead of husband or wife, or girlfriend or boyfriend, leaders at key leadership positions who are very diverse per se. How important is representation is a question on my mind. And then especially when I think about the queer community, because representation, queer community, not easy, right?
Yeah.
Which does mean that it's a self-declaration that you need to do,
Yeah.
I know I've probably put in a few points out there.
But let's
right?
try and unravel that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
To what you said. One of my favorite quotes and dialogues on this is actually from Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Okay.
It's like one of my all-time favorite shows. And I hope that I get it right, so I'll go a little slowly. Every time someone steps up and says who they are, the world becomes a better, more interesting place. And that's what the captain says to, I think, Rosa when she comes out,
Okay.
right?
Nice.
And I just love that quote because it completely captures the essence of what inclusion, diversity, and what individual feeling is all about. So it is, first of all, it's a question of personal choice, number one. But how can you make that personal choice easier is exactly by what you said, which is about creating a lot more representation, and that's where symbolism helps, right? So while I share the same conflict as you do every time Pride Month comes along, but I have to admit that the symbolism really helps there, right? The representation really helps there. The fact is that we've come a long way. I mean, today you and I are sitting here as members of the queer community and having a conversation, which may not have been possible, say, 15 years ago, right? Absolutely not.
Today.
It's still rare today, exactly. But it's a start, right? I mean, I've been fortunate enough to work with organizations, Accenture, Walmart, GSK, etc., where we have made a conscious effort to make sure that there were strong leadership role models and try to build a culture within the company where people get sensitized about things like using the right pronouns, for example, or just avoiding gender stereotypes when it comes to conversations and so on, right? So I think it does make a difference. But having said that, it is a personal choice. And the flip side of what this dialogue says holds true, that every time you create an environment where people are not able to step up and who they are, the world just becomes a little less interesting. It just becomes dull. It becomes homogeneous. And I think more and more leaders are starting to recognize that. I do see a lot more leaders having deeper conversations with their team members, talking about their lives, getting to know them, which was not the case when I started in my career in HR 20 years ago, right? Where leaders are there and the kind of relationships that they had with their team members was very different. So I think as part of that gradual change, people will start and are starting to get more comfortable. And I do think it's an important measure to keep in mind as well, because it tells you whether you're actually creating safe spaces for people to come out and declare who they are and be open about it.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah, totally. Totally, I get it. So you're saying that it is important also.
It is very important, I feel. It's very important. It's obviously left to personal choice, but to the extent to which it's happening and not happening is also an indicator of the kind of culture you're trying to build in the organization. And I think that's where visible symbolism, visible leadership representation makes a lot of difference.
Yeah. That brings me, Sudeep, to another question on my mind, right? That how do we ensure that, great, there are so many policies out there today when it comes to inclusion, right? On paper. And it's great. Now, even if there's some representation in the company, people feel a little safe, then they come out. Now, how do you ensure that how one feels, how inclusive one feels, continues to stay on the ground, on the grassroots level?
I agree.
That whole behavioral change.
Yeah, I agree. I was going through this article which quoted this research by Randstad, which had a great data point which said that, as per the survey they conducted, etc., 70% of leaders who belong to MNC organizations have specific goals related to LGBTQ plus agenda, which is great. The same survey also said that some 70-80% of respondents, which were regular employees across organizations, felt that the leadership agenda had not translated into change at the ground level. Right. And I do see that dissonance very, very regularly. Right. And I think we really need to think deeply about how we are going to convert the larger leadership conversations into change at a ground level. I will tell you conversations I have, and these are actual verbatim conversations where someone came and said that I feel that I've not got promoted because my boss realized that I'm gay. There's someone who said, I want to hire a man, and I'm going a little off agenda here, but I want to hire a man in my team because there's a lot of work, and this is the woman manager saying it, that I want to hire a man in my team because there's a lot of work, and men will be able to manage the load better because they can manage their work lives, right? There's someone else who told me that their manager told them, if you've got COVID, don't declare it to us because then you'll have to take leave and we can't afford that. I mean, and these are great organizations, right? And these are organizations where the agenda of inclusion and well-being is being thoroughly regarded, practiced, talked about. But at the ground level, this is reality. So how do you bridge that distance? And at least companies that I've come from, I mean, we've been trying to constantly up our game in terms of listening mechanisms, right? How do you listen more? How do you use the right combination of larger generic surveys with some personalized nudges and pulse checks with personal connects as much as possible, focus group discussions to surface some of these? And that's what I would love to ask you as well, right? That do you feel that the answer is different for different kinds of organizations, both in terms of maybe location as well as scale? Like, how does it work? What are the advantages and maybe the flip sides of being part of smaller organizations, which, on the same topic, on driving behavioral change at the ground level?
Right. I think, in my experience, scale can be a game changer. With the smaller organizations, I think the huge benefit one has is that you can directly work with the founders themselves, starting with the question of, listen, what do you want your culture to be, look and feel like? And then within that, now put the words diversity and inclusion, and then talk to me about, hey, how do you again want this to feel like? Right? Or not. That's also being honest. It's not up to sometimes you don't have to, you can also say that we're not that diverse. We are going to hire 60-70% male members, example. Be bold and put it out there. It is fine if it doesn't work for you. But I think...
but get it clear from the upfront.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a huge benefit of starting right from the very start.
I agree.
And also because the scale is small, the listening mechanisms, right? I think it's easier to kind of get to know through visible examples on the ground, whether something that you've rolled out as a policy is working or not. So you can, I think, you're more closer to the people on your ground,
Right.
and then you get to hear about the examples, and then you can get to take an action on it.
Right.
There's a huge benefit of that over there.
Absolutely. No, I think exactly the flip side with larger organizations, right? And speed is a thing, right? About how the speed at which you can execute and do. But when you do it, it makes a lot more impact, right? Because you're able to do it at a much larger scale and so on. And then you have the benefit of being backed up by organizational frameworks, policies, and even systems that are just more tuned to helping this agenda. But I agree. I think that's something that all of us, whether it be small or large organizations, really need to get right, which is listening more deeply and surfacing the actual reality on the ground and what the potential conflict is between what leaders are saying and doing.
Right. Yeah. And not assume that because you've rolled something out, things are all hunky-dory on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. This is one of my favorite words, measure and data. I'm sure you'd also agree, I think, not just in the HR world, right? In the way we work in companies per se, right? Anything and everything that we do, at the end of the day, we say that, hey, what is the outcome? What is the impact? How are we measuring it? Make it data-based. And if you're not able to measure it, that means you probably not move the needle anywhere, or your effort is getting leaked. What is your thought? Especially when it comes to, I think, inclusion, and then inclusion with respect to the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, where is the data, right? So when companies are doing or having initiatives over here, how does one measure it? What is your thought on that?
I'm going to flip this back at you again, to be honest. I don't not have a very clear... It's a conflict we've struggled with, right? Because obviously representation as far as the queer community is concerned there are only parts of it which are visible, right? When you work with the people from the transgender community, for example, right? Which is a very certain community with a certain boundaries, etc. But otherwise, it's very difficult to measure it. And the big question is, should we? Right? Or are there better ways of doing it? Are there better indicators out there? But you come from an organization which is all about measurement and assessment. So why don't you tell me? I mean, what are your thoughts around really measurement and you're right. I mean, every organization is talking about measuring and ROI, etc. But what is the ROI here? What is the measurement here? Right, beyond the broader inclusion space and the culture space. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting one. So, measure is important, extremely, extremely important, and I think it can be used as a lever. It can be fabulous if you want to drive a culture of inclusion. Example also in what we're doing as a product, we were saying, hey, look at the skills, measure the skills, right, and then don't look at anything else and don't be biased. At the same time, I think what's happening today, and that's where I want to put the spotlight to people on, is don't get carried away, right? You use the lever, you take a decision on how do you want to measure, when do you measure, and probably when not, or different ways to measure, as you were saying earlier. Because when we're talking about a behavioral change, a transformational cultural change, then your data points might not be as concrete and quantifying as you're expecting it to be. But that's based on your expectation, which means be realistic, right? The measure over here can be just about how many examples are you seeing year on year? How many people are coming and talking to you, right? About the programs you've done, how many people and how, the feedback on those programs, how many people are talking to you more and more about, I've come out recently because, hey, you've done this initiative, and then I just genuinely felt like the space and my colleagues were open, and I felt it's like a space, and I could talk to my colleagues about my partner. But I think it's about that and those examples which are very, very valuable. And then you see what do you want to do next.
But it's important to keep observing all of those things
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
Because especially in the absence of standard, assessment and standard measurement mechanisms, it's very important, and that goes back to that point about listening, saying you have to keep observing some of these indicators and figuring out what are you hearing and what are you seeing on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, people, for example, have all these really interesting programs on returnship for, say, women on a career break, for example, or hiring people from the transgender community, and all of these programs, which is great. But what we only hear about is the number of people hired, etc., which companies tout. And it's good to have that data. But what's more important is a year down the line, how are those people feeling about it, right? And the answer can sometimes be very different. So that's the part which I think is more important. And in some cases, even for hyper data obsessive organizations, it is okay to step back and say, this is not something we're going to get data on. It is more a factor of indicators that we're going to use, like you said. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Bang on. And I think, this whole, if people have to take an action, and going back to what you're saying, right? And having champions per se on the ground to constantly observe and just connect the dots back and feed the data back on, and just putting the onus, I think, on a few people. Again, people, I think, really
and then
helps.
finding those champions, right?
Finding those champions.
Yeah. And usually in good organizations, you will find them. And then you just need one or two champions to really become sort of, I wouldn't say torch bearers, but at least visible symbols of progress and culture change.
Right. Yeah. Because then people also know that, hey, I can talk to this person.
Yeah.
For sure.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Okay. So tell me. So you worked with some really, I think, interesting, great organizations like, as you said, Accenture, Walmart, GSK, and now Upstox. Okay. Learnings on D&I that you feel like, coming to Upstox, you're quite excited to use when it comes to D&I practice. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is really that, at the cost of talking about my age, I have spent 20 years, 20 years in this field. And from the point where I remember in my first job, getting into the Bay Area and just seeing a sea of men dressed similarly, with not even one single woman on the entire production floor, to today where we are talking so actively and passionately about this agenda, there's been a huge change. And I think the learnings really are both on things that we should do and we shouldn't do. Getting hyper obsessive about data, for example, is not something we should do.
Right.
Trying to look at this more from a symbolic perspective only is not something we should do. You learn on the ground. You learn about how to, for example, be smart enough to identify teams and leaders in your organization who will then become champions for you. So, for example, in GSK, we started thinking about how to get more women into the field force, sales field force. And it was easy to do it in the headquarters or anywhere else, but we actually went and found a team in one part of the region which was a lot more inclusive. Like I said, it was welcoming, it was positive, and we were able to pilot it there. And that pilot became, the source of change for a lot of the future to come, right? And I think I've always been very fortunate that all these organizations have had a very active culture of inclusion. Their values have been all about respect, letting people be and people be themselves.
Right.
So I think going back to your point, the learnings that I bring is really about getting it right at the first place. The question that you ask, what kind of culture you want to bring, and what kind of culture do you want to build for the future, is a tough question to ask, but it's a question which is very, very fundamental and necessary. Identifying a few champions. I was having a conversation with our product leader at Upstox a few days ago, and we were talking about how we can think about creating and making the app and the website a lot more inclusive and a lot more accessible. And it was really nice for me that he and his team, who are working 24/7 in a hyper growth environment, could easily have stepped back and said, you know what, great idea, but not a priority right now. Let's talk about it later. But he didn't. it's a measure of the values of the company that he was very, very open to it, and now he and I are working together to identify people who can help us do that, right? So I think getting that right, and I come from a position of privilege. I've had the privilege of choosing the companies I want to work with. Not a lot of people have that. But at least wherever I've had that privilege, I think I have tried to exercise that choice by consciously choosing companies and leaders that I know will be in sync with my values and my thinking around culture and what we want to bring there. So I think all the stuff that we've spoken about, right, is really derived from my learnings. Identifying wherever there are gaps between what leadership is saying and what the ground reality is. Identifying champions who can really become, your role models for the future. Identifying leaders who can truly become your champions, right? I was pleasantly surprised with Walmart when we started talking about resource groups, etc. And I had a bunch of our leadership team putting up their hands and saying, I'm willing to invest time and do this. And I see the same thing at Upstox now. Right. So I just find that really fascinating, right? So I think it's a question of taking that first step forward and using a good combination of conversations on culture, getting the values right, getting the direction right, getting the right champions, putting the right organizational frameworks in place. Right. It's no point doing all this if your job descriptions, for example, don't have the right pronouns, right? Or your site still sounds or looks very non-inclusive to certain parts of the community. So get your fundamentals right, get the champions in place, get the culture right. You don't have to do everything all at once. But I'm a huge believer in this, right? Do less stuff, but do it impactfully and deeply. I think that's truly the route to changing culture for the long term.
Okay.
Do you agree?
No, I totally agree with you on that. Thanks for sharing all that points. One thing on my mind is, when you were kind of sharing your points is, what about the people who probably say, I don't want to be inclusive? What about the people who probably say, hey, LGBTQ plus, what are these alphabets? Alphabet mafia, I've heard that from someone,
Really?
Like, what is going on? I don't believe in it. It doesn't exist. What about the voice of those people?
I completely agree with you. It's equally important to have multiple voices in the room, right? And we would be really being very, very hypocritical if we were to ignore those voices. And in fact, when we launched the entire agenda and the Pride Resource Group in Walmart, what we also did is we set up like a daily counseling service or a conversational service, to call it, where people could just come and talk about anything. And we gave leading questions saying, if you don't agree with this, right, you can also come and talk about it. And we did have people who spoke up and said that it didn't, right? Whether it's because of their sometimes religious beliefs, sometimes the background they come from, they felt that it was not right, or they felt this topic did not deserve to be discussed. I think it's important to engage in a conversation, and sometimes it's okay to agree to disagree. You're not going to have 10,000 people, 1 lakh people, 2 lakh, 3 lakh people agreeing to exactly the same agenda. But I think from a very hard-nosed practical point of view, what you need to be very careful about is those people should not become active detractors. Right? Because that can create toxicity in the environment.
True.
So that's what you need to keep an eye on. But can you expect your entire workforce to be active supporters on anything? I mean, not just this. I mean, there are so many other topics out there on well-being, for example, on so many other topics on performance. Let's talk about the bell curve.
Oh God! Don't even get started.
So let's not even get started there, right? It's okay to have a wide range of opinions in the organization, and it's equally important, to your point, to make sure that they have a voice and engage them. But then at the end of the day, you agree to disagree and make sure that the ones who may not be completely in support of any agenda, whether it be related to performance management or the Pride agenda, don't become active detractors. That's what you need to be careful about.
That's a good one. Don't become active detractors. Yeah. And I think that's also part of inclusion, isn't it?
Exactly.
Making those voices also felt heard. And inclusive, having a conversation with them. Don't make them active detractors. And I think that also means inclusion on its own. I think, when you were saying this, one of the things that stood out on my mind was, I really like it, the whole approach of inclusion is personal. This is something that we did very actively in one of the earlier companies, wherein you actually called people in and said, inclusion is personal. What
Right.
inclusion? We want to know what inclusion means to you to start with, and then of course, then this is what inclusion means to the company, and then we see what the gap is, and let's have a conversation
That's a
about
nice way of- yeah.
can we meet midway
Yeah.
or not? That's okay too. Then
Yeah.
we'll agree to disagree, kind of a thing,
Completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And sometimes it requires people to stand up and that's why safe space is important. For people to sometimes stand up and challenge stereotypes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And hear them. And sometimes what we are thinking as leaders about what's on top of mind may be very, very different.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. It was really nice chatting with you. Thank you for very patiently answering questions.
And likewise, thank you for engaging. And I love the fact that I was able to put you on the hotspot and
Yeah,
ask you a
thanks.
few questions as well.
Thanks
So
for
I'm
that.
I'm glad about that. But thanks, and I think we covered a very wide range of topics, and I really liked it. It's provoked a lot of thought in me as well. So I'm going to go back and do some rethinking on how we are doing things and what we need to do. And I hope that whoever watches this conversation
Yeah.
has a similar reaction to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like it that you're going to help put the spotlight back on overall inclusion while we are talking, in June about Pride, about, everything else. But I think the more important part of inclusion overall, I think needs to say so. I'm really glad you put the spotlight back on that.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.